When Laura and I first got together, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. She was smart, charming, and had this magnetic energy that drew people in. Especially me. We were married for 7 years, and while life wasn't perfect, I always believed our connection was strong enough to weather anything. But that was before I started noticing her secret life unfolding right under my nose. It began with a change so small it was almost unnoticeable. Laura had always been social, but suddenly, she was glued to her phone, responding to messages with a smile that seemed far too personal. I assumed she was just catching up with friends, but then she started taking those calls in private, lowering her voice whenever I walked into the room. It wasn't just once or twice. It was becoming a pattern. The first major red flag appeared on our shared calendar. Laura had blocked out an entire day, labeling it as personal time. This wasn't like her. She was always transparent about her schedule. I casually asked if she was doing something special, and she shrugged it off with a vague excuse about needing to recharge. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. So, I did something I'd never thought I'd do. I set up a tracking app on her phone. I hated myself for it, but I needed to know if I was being paranoid. The first few days, there was nothing unusual. She went to work, ran errands, had lunch with friends. Then came the day she'd marked as personal time. Laura drove 2 towns over to a small industrial area with old, rundown warehouses. She parked outside one of them for nearly 2 hours. It didn't make sense. There was nothing in that area. No shops, no cafes, just empty buildings. I watched her return home later that day, acting completely normal, as if she hadn't just spent hours in some desolate part of town. I needed answers, so I made a decision. The next time she went there, I'd follow her. 2 weeks later, she marked another personal day, and I trailed behind her, keeping my distance. She led me to the same warehouse, but this time, instead of staying in the car, she walked inside. I waited a few minutes before approaching, trying to look casual as I made my way up to the entrance. The metal door creaked as I nudged it open, revealing a dimly lit corridor that smelled of damp concrete. What I saw next left me in shock. The room was filled with computer equipment, monitors, servers, cables running everywhere, and in the middle a high-tech setup that resembled a hacker's den. Laura was standing in front of one of the screens, talking to a man I'd never seen before. He had a scar across his left cheek and wore a headset, his voice calm and businesslike as he showed her something on the monitor. I ducked behind some crates, straining to hear their conversation. From what I could gather, they weren't just chatting casually. They were planning something big, something dangerous. He mentioned Phase 2 and safeguarding the assets, and Laura nodded, asking questions about transfers and blackouts. It didn't take long to realize this wasn't an affair. It was something much darker. Before I could process what I was witnessing, Laura suddenly said, "We need to be careful. If he finds out, it could ruin everything." I felt the blood drain from my face. They were talking about me. My pulse was racing, and my mind struggled to piece together what I just overheard. Laura, my wife, was involved in something secretive, something illegal, and they were worried I'd find out. As I crouched behind those crates, the gravity of the situation began to settle in. If I confronted her now, she'd know I'd been spying, and if these people were dangerous, it could escalate quickly. I stayed hidden, listening intently. The man with the scar continued talking, giving Laura instructions about the next phase, which apparently involved some kind of encrypted financial transfers. I couldn't catch every word, but phrases like clean accounts, digital footprints, and offshore holdings jumped out at me. They weren't just hiding an affair, they were hiding an entire operation. Laura nodded at his instructions, then asked, "And what if he gets suspicious? What if he starts digging?" "Then we handle him," the man replied, his voice flat and emotionless. "You know the risks." Chills ran down my spine. I wasn't just being betrayed. My life could actually be in danger. I needed proof, solid evidence that I could use to confront Laura without putting myself at risk. I decided to record as much of the conversation as possible on my phone before making a quiet exit. Later that night, I acted as if nothing had changed. Laura returned home with takeout, kissed me on the cheek, and asked about my day. I was struggling to look at her the same way. Was she just playing a role all these years? Who was this woman I married, really? I had to know what she was doing behind my back and how deep this rabbit hole went. I spent the next few days combing through the recording. Most of what I captured was a mix of tech jargon and vague references to clients, accounts, and some kind of transfer schedule. It was clear they were working with large sums of money, but how and why eluded me. I needed more context, more answers. That's when I came up with a risky plan. I would break into that warehouse when it was empty and search for any documents or files that could reveal what they were really up to. A week later, I got my chance. Laura had left town for a business trip, or at least that's what she told me. I drove out to the warehouse in the dead of night, making sure no one was around. The place was quiet, almost too quiet, and the stillness in the air made my heart pound harder than I'd expected. I found a back entrance that seemed easier to pry open than the main door. After a bit of struggling with the lock, I finally made my way inside. The place was just as I remembered it. Dark, cold, and lined with rows of computers and servers. I searched the desks, flipping through papers, checking for any information that might explain what Laura was involved in. Then I saw it, a file with my name on it. It was tucked away in a drawer, almost as if it was hidden there on purpose. I hesitated before picking it up, afraid of what I might find. Inside were detailed reports, photos of me, even logs of my daily activities. It felt like I was reading a profile put together by a private investigator or a spy agency. There were notes about my schedule, places I frequently visited, and even my online activity. I suddenly realized this wasn't just a case of me spying on my wife. She and her associates had been tracking me for months, if not years. I'd been a target all along. The implications were staggering. Was my marriage a setup from the start? Had Laura been manipulating me the entire time? Or did something change along the way? I had too many questions and not enough answers. But one thing was clear. I needed to get out of there fast. As I turned to leave, I heard a faint click behind me. The warehouse door slowly swung open, and the man with the scar stepped in, holding a flashlight that swept across the room. I ducked behind a server rack, holding my breath as the beam of light came dangerously close to my hiding spot. I crouched behind the server rack, trying to calm my frantic heartbeat. The man with the scar moved methodically through the warehouse, his flashlight sweeping across the floor and over the equipment. I held my breath, praying that he wouldn't notice anything out of place. Just when I thought he might leave, his flashlight landed on the open drawer where I'd found the file. He walked over and picked up the scattered papers, his brow furrowing as he glanced around the room. "I know someone's in here," he called out, his voice low and menacing. "You better come out now, or this will get ugly." I couldn't let him find me, not after what I'd just discovered. I carefully inched toward the emergency exit on the far side of the warehouse, staying low and using the rows of servers for cover. I was almost at the door when I heard a loud crash. The man had knocked over a stack of crates, trying to flush me out. I didn't wait to see if he'd spotted me. I bolted for the exit. As I pushed the door open, an alarm blared, echoing through the warehouse. I sprinted to my car and tore out of the parking lot, glancing in the rearview mirror to see the man running after me. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, but I couldn't afford to lose focus. I had to get out of there and figure out my next move. Back at home, I locked the doors and double-checked the windows, paranoia creeping in. I knew they'd realize someone had broken in, and it wouldn't take long for them to suspect me. But for now, I needed to process everything I'd found. I spread the documents from the file across the kitchen table, trying to make sense of them. The logs of my daily activities were disturbingly detailed, right down to the times I left for work and returned home. There were notes about my past, things I'd only ever told Laura in confidence, things she must have shared with them. But why would they need to keep tabs on me? And more importantly, why was Laura involved? Among the papers, I found a printout of an email chain between Laura and the man I saw at the warehouse. They were discussing a deadline that was quickly approaching, and there was mention of a target that needed to be dealt with. It didn't take much to figure out who that target was. It was me. Panic surged through me. Had Laura been plotting to get rid of me all along? Was she just using our marriage as a cover for something sinister? Couldn't wrap my head around it. I'd loved this woman, shared my life with her, and now she was conspiring against me. I had to find a way to turn the tables before it was too late. The next day, I went through our shared bank accounts and found something peculiar. There were recent withdrawals of large sums of money, transferred to an offshore account I'd never heard of. It seemed like Laura and her partners were siphoning off our savings, preparing for something big, perhaps an escape. I knew I needed help, but I couldn't go to the police without concrete evidence of their illegal activities. What I had wasn't enough to prove Laura's involvement in a criminal conspiracy. If I wanted to survive this, I had to gather more information, and fast. The first step was figuring out how to intercept their communications. I'd taken some basic cybersecurity courses in college, but I needed more than that to break into a setup as sophisticated as theirs. After some research, I found a private investigator who specialized in corporate espionage. It was risky, but I reached out to him, giving only vague details about my situation. We arranged to meet in a neutral location, and I hoped to God I wasn't making a mistake. The investigator, a grizzled man named Vince, listened to my story without interrupting, his expression grim. "You're in deep, my friend," he said when I finished. "If your wife and her associates are as dangerous as you say, then you've got a real mess on your hands. But I might be able to help for the right price." I didn't have much of a choice. I handed Vince the documents I'd taken from the warehouse and the recordings from my phone. He assured me he'd dig into the details, but his warning was clear. Stay out of sight, and don't do anything that'll tip them off. They're already watching you. As I drove away from the meeting, I realized the gravity of my situation. I wasn't just fighting to save my marriage anymore. I was fighting to stay alive. Days passed and my nerves were on edge. I didn't hear back from Vince right away, which only made the waiting more unbearable. I couldn't shake the feeling that every move I made was being watched, that someone was lurking just outside my line of sight. I started noticing cars that seemed to follow me, strange faces in familiar places, and even odd glitches on my phone. Finally, Vince called. "We need to meet," he said, his tone urgent. We arranged to meet in a busy coffee shop downtown, where I figured it would be safer than a secluded location. I arrived early, scanning the crowd for any signs of danger, and sat in the back corner, facing the entrance. When Vince walked in, he looked even more troubled than before. He slid into the seat across from me, lowering his voice as he spoke. "I found out some things, and it's worse than I thought," he said, glancing around as if to make sure we weren't being watched. "Your wife isn't just part of some scam. She's tied up in a dangerous network. They're involved in high-level cybercrime, money laundering, and even targeted hits." My stomach dropped. "Hits? You mean like killing people?" Vince nodded grimly. "And they're not amateurs. They cover their tracks well, using dummy accounts and encrypted communications. The offshore account you found? That's just one of many. There's evidence they're preparing for a big move, something involving a massive transfer of funds. If they succeed, they'll disappear without a trace. But here's the kicker. I found a reference to a cleanup job scheduled for the end of the month. That job is you." The weight of his words crushed me. I was living on borrowed time. I'd never felt more betrayed, and the realization that Laura was involved in something so deadly was too much to bear. I'd been married to this woman for 7 years, and now she was conspiring to end my life. "I can't just sit around and wait for them to come after me," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. "I need to confront Laura. I need to know why she's doing this." "Bad idea," Vince cut in. "If you confront her now, you'll be walking straight into their trap. She might even speed up the timeline if she realizes you're onto her." "But I can't keep living like this," I argued. "If they're planning something, I have to be one step ahead. Can't you hack their communications or trace the transfers?" Vince rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "I might be able to set up a sting, create a diversion to force them to reveal themselves. But it's risky. If they catch on, it'll be game over for both of us." Desperation fueled my decision. "Let's do it," I said. "Whatever it takes." We spent the next few days preparing. Vince created a fake email account posing as a potential buyer interested in making a deal with Laura's network. The goal was to bait them into a meeting, using the promise of a lucrative transaction to lure them out. If it worked, we could intercept their communication and finally gather enough evidence to take them down. The plan was set in motion, but things started to unravel sooner than we'd expected. 2 days later, I came home to find Laura sitting on the living room couch, her phone in hand. She didn't look angry. She looked concerned, almost apologetic. "I've been worried about you," she said softly. "You've been acting strange lately. Is there something you're not telling me?" It was a trap. I could sense it in the way she was watching me, as if trying to gauge my reaction. I forced a smile and shrugged. "Work's been stressful, that's all. Nothing to worry about." But she didn't seem convinced. Her eyes lingered on me for a moment longer before she stood up. "If there's anything you want to talk about, I'm here. Okay?" The way she said it, it was as if she was offering me one last chance to confess, or perhaps to walk right into her web. I knew then that the walls were closing in faster than I'd anticipated. That night, Vince called again. "They're on to us," he said without any greeting. The bait worked, but they countered with a message. "Tell your friend to back off, or he won't live to regret it. They know I'm involved." Cold fear gripped me. They had anticipated our moves, and now I was out of time. We needed to act, and act fast, or everything I tried to protect would crumble in an instant. Couldn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house and every gust of wind rattling the windows made me jump. My mind was racing with thoughts of Laura's betrayal, the danger I was in, and the warning Vince had received. The situation was spiraling out of control, and it felt like there was no way to escape without serious consequences. The next morning, Vince and I met up to discuss our next move. He had managed to trace some of the offshore accounts linked to Laura's network, revealing a complex web of shell companies and fake identities. "These people are professionals," he said. "They're not just running a scam, they're running an empire. And if we're going to bring them down, we'll need to hit them where it hurts. Their money." Vince's plan was to siphon a small portion of the funds from one of the accounts, enough to get their attention without triggering a full-blown alarm. The idea was to make it look like an inside job, which would hopefully create friction within their network and buy us more time to gather evidence. It was risky, but at this point we didn't have any safer options. The transfer was set to happen that night. Vince had rigged a temporary server to intercept any communications they sent after discovering the breach. If everything went according to plan, we'd have a lead on their next move by morning. But things didn't go according to plan. Around midnight, I received a call from an unknown number. I hesitated before answering, and when I did, a distorted voice on the other end greeted me. "You thought you could play with fire and not get burned?" it said, the tone menacing. "You should have listened when we warned you to back off." The line went dead before I could respond, and a chill ran through me. I rushed to call Vince, but there was no answer. Panic surged as I realized that something had gone wrong. Terribly wrong. I jumped into my car and sped to his office, praying that I wasn't too late. When I arrived, the building was dark and the door was ajar. I pushed it open, calling Vince's name, but there was no response. As I stepped inside, the faint smell of burnt electronics filled the air. The room was a mess. Papers scattered across the floor, computers smashed, and the temporary server we'd set up was destroyed. I found Vince slumped over his desk, unconscious but still breathing. I shook him awake, and he groggily opened his eyes. "They found us," he muttered, his voice weak. "Wiped the server. Took everything." He was in rough shape, with a bruise forming on the side of his face. It was clear he'd put up a fight. "We need to get out of here," I said, helping him to his feet. "They know where we are." We managed to get to my car and drove off, our paranoia heightened by every passing vehicle. We ended up at a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, where I checked us in under a fake name. Vince needed time to recover, and I needed a new plan. It was clear that our adversaries were several steps ahead, but there was one advantage I still had. They didn't know that I'd kept a backup of the documents from the warehouse. It wasn't much, but it was something to work with. While Vince rested, I combed through the data once again, hoping to find a clue I'd missed the first time. That's when I found it. An email thread buried deep in a folder, dated over a year ago. It was between Laura and a mysterious contact known only as X. The messages discussed a target, an infiltration, and a long-term strategy. My heart sank as I read further and realized they were talking about me. This had all been planned from the start. The messages detailed how Laura had been assigned to get close to me, gain my trust, and eventually marry me. I was nothing more than a pawn in their game, a cover for whatever illegal operations they were conducting. It was never about love or our life together, it was about using me as a shield. I was furious, heartbroken, and disgusted all at once. How could I have been so blind? Everything, our wedding, the memories, the laughter, it had all been fake. I was living in a manufactured reality, and the woman I thought I loved was the architect of my downfall. But as devastating as this revelation was, it also fueled me with a new resolve. I wasn't just going to expose them, I was going to destroy them. They had taken everything from me, and I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I woke Vince and showed him what I'd found. "We have to take this to the authorities," I said. "It's our only chance." He nodded slowly, still recovering but determined. "But we need more than just emails," he said. "We need undeniable proof, something that ties them directly to the crimes." And that's when I realized what I had to do. I needed to confront Laura face to face one last time. This time, I wasn't looking for answers. I was looking for closure. I knew confronting Laura would be risky, but I needed to see her true face one last time. There was no turning back now. I was past the point of no return. I set up a meeting at a cafe we used to visit often, choosing a public place to minimize the chance of things getting out of hand. When she arrived, I could see the concern in her eyes, but it felt hollow, like a mask she had perfected over time. As she sat down across from me, I noticed her scanning the room, probably looking for signs of a trap. She was smart, but this time I had the advantage. "What's going on, Matt?" she asked, her voice a careful mix of worry and innocence. "You've been acting so strangely lately. Is there something you're not telling me?" I took a deep breath, keeping my voice steady. "Cut the act, Laura. I know everything. The offshore accounts, the network, the fact that you've been lying to me since the day we met." For a moment, I saw a flash of something in her eyes. Surprise, maybe fear. But she quickly recovered, her expression hardening. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, her tone colder now. "You're clearly not thinking straight, Matt. You've been spending too much time with that hacker friend of yours. He's filling your head with nonsense." I leaned in, lowering my voice to keep the conversation from attracting too much attention. "I found the emails, Laura. The ones between you and X. You were sent to infiltrate my life, to use me as a cover for your criminal operations. Don't pretend it's not true." There was a pause, and then she smirked. A small, bitter smile. "You always were more perceptive than they gave you credit for. But if you think you can expose us, you're delusional. This is bigger than you, Matt. It's bigger than either of us." Her sudden shift in tone made it clear that she wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. The Laura I thought I knew was gone, replaced by a ruthless operative who had been playing me all along. "Why me?" I asked, my voice tinged with a mixture of anger and betrayal. "Out of all the people, why did you choose me?" "Because you were easy," she said with a shrug. "You were the perfect mark, stable, predictable, and well-connected enough to make our operations run smoothly without raising suspicion. You were convenient." Her words cut deeper than any knife ever could. 7 years of marriage, of shared memories, all dismissed as convenient. I felt a wave of rage surge through me, but I kept it under control. I wasn't here to argue. I was here to get the final piece of evidence. "I've already handed everything over to the authorities," I lied, watching her reaction carefully. "They're coming for you and your little network. It's only a matter of time." She didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "If that were true, you wouldn't be sitting here right now. You'd be in a safe house, under witness protection, praying that we didn't find you first." She paused, a dark glint in her eyes. "But you're not, are you?" which means you haven't told them anything yet. She was right. I hadn't gone to the authorities because I didn't trust that they could protect me, or Vince, if things went south. Laura's network was too powerful and too well connected. If I was going to bring them down, I needed something concrete, something explosive that would ensure there was no escape for them. Just as I was about to push her for more information, she leaned in close, her voice barely a whisper. "You're in way over your head, Matt. If you walk away now, I might be able to convince them to spare you. But if you keep pushing, you won't like what happens next." It was a thinly veiled threat, but I didn't back down. "I'm not scared of you," I said, meeting her gaze. "And I'm not walking away. This ends with you and your whole network going down." She stared at me for a long moment, then stood up and adjusted her coat. "Good luck with that," she said before turning to leave. "I hope you're ready for what's coming." As I watched her walk out of the cafe, I knew I had just painted a target on my back. If there was any doubt before, it was gone now. Laura was deeply involved, and she wasn't going to back down easily. But I had something she didn't know about. A voice recording device hidden in my jacket pocket. I captured every word of our conversation. It wasn't a confession, but it was a start. I quickly sent the recording to Vince, hoping he'd be able to use it to track down any more leads. I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, and I wasn't sure how much longer we could keep playing this dangerous game without getting caught. The following day, Vince called me with a breakthrough. "I found a trace of Laura's contact X," he said, his voice filled with both urgency and excitement. "It's not much, but it's a start. There's an old safe house registered under one of the shell companies we've been tracking. It's outside the city, and if we're lucky, we might find something there that ties them all together." It was a long shot, but it was all we had. I agreed to meet Vince at the location the next night. This time, I was prepared for anything, whatever it took to end this once and for all. The safe house was a rundown building at the edge of a forest, secluded enough to keep prying eyes away. Vince and I parked our car a few hundred yards down the road and approached on foot, keeping low and silent. The place looked abandoned, but we both knew that appearances could be deceiving. We circled the perimeter, finding no signs of movement. The front door was locked, but Vince quickly picked the lock, and we slipped inside. The air was stale and dust covered the furniture, but something about the place felt active, like it had been recently used and hastily abandoned. As we searched the rooms, Vince found a locked cabinet in what looked like an old study. It took him a few minutes to crack it open, and inside we found files, hard drives, and a couple of burner phones. This was it, the jackpot. I could feel it in my gut that we had stumbled onto something big. We spread out the documents across a dusty desk and began scanning through them. Most were coded or encrypted, but a few notes and photographs were clear enough to understand. The photos were of me, taken over the past several years in various places. My work, my gym, even my parents' house. I had been under surveillance for longer than I could have imagined. Vince found a ledger that seemed to detail payments made to various operatives. One of the names listed stood out immediately, Laura. She had been paid well for her services, and from the look of it, the payments began a year before we even met. The entire relationship was a setup from the start. Suddenly, we heard a car approaching. Vince and I froze, exchanging a look of alarm. "We need to go now," he whispered urgently. But before we could move, the front door creaked open. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. Someone was inside. We quickly hid in a small closet, pulling the door shut as quietly as possible. Through the narrow gap, I saw two figures step into the study. One of them was unmistakably Laura, while the other, a tall, broad-shouldered man, seemed to be X. Their conversation confirmed it. "Are you sure he didn't go to the authorities?" X asked, his voice deep and gravelly. "Positive," Laura replied. "Matt isn't stupid enough to go to the cops. He thinks he can take us down himself. But I told you we should have taken him out sooner. Now, he and that hacker friend are poking around too much." Hearing her speak so casually about taking me out chilled me to the bone. Laura had already decided my fate long before I even confronted her at the cafe. I looked over at Vince, who was clutching his phone tightly, preparing to record every word. We needed this evidence. But then, Laura's phone rang, breaking the tension. She answered it with an irritated, "What is it?" I could only hear her side of the conversation, but whatever was being said made her expression darken. "You're sure?" she asked, then hung up and turned to X. "They found the backup files at Vince's office. We need to wrap this up now." She pulled a gun from her coat, and X nodded, heading back toward the hallway. My heart raced as I realized they were going to burn the place down. They couldn't leave any loose ends, and that included the evidence we had just found, and us. Vince and I had to act fast. As they left the room, we burst out of the closet, grabbing as many documents and hard drives as we could carry. We made a break for the back door, but just as we reached it, X caught sight of us. "Stop!" he yelled, reaching for his own weapon. Without thinking, I shoved a nearby bookshelf toward him, knocking him off balance. It gave us just enough time to get out the back door and sprint toward the woods. Gunshots rang out behind us, and adrenaline pumped through my veins. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. We threw the files and hard drives into the trunk and sped off, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. Vince was already on the phone with his contact at a federal agency, arranging a meeting to hand over the evidence. We had more than enough to take Laura and her entire network down. Or so we thought. The authorities raided the safe house the next day, but it had been torched. Any trace of Laura and X was gone, and the operatives we'd exposed in the documents vanished without a trace. It was as if they'd never existed. The investigation dragged on for months. The files we retrieved proved to be enough to dismantle some of the organization's operations, but many higher-ups slipped away. Laura, too, disappeared like a ghost, leaving behind no trace except for a single postcard that arrived at my doorstep a year later. On it was a picture of a beach, no return address, just a handwritten message. "Nice try, Matt. Hope you enjoyed the game." It was a brutal reminder that, in the end, I was just another piece in their puzzle. Laura may have been a traitor, but she was also a master manipulator, and I had never truly known who she was. Vince and I continued to help the authorities track down any remaining members of the network, but the scars left by Laura's betrayal would never heal. I would always wonder if I was still being watched, if she was out there somewhere, laughing at my attempts to find her. But one thing was clear: the woman I once loved had never existed. She was a fabrication, a carefully crafted persona designed to ensnare me. The real Laura, whoever she was, had slipped through my fingers like sand, leaving nothing but a hollow ache and a sense of unfinished business. And so I kept searching, not because I thought I'd ever catch her, but because I needed to understand how I could have been so blind, and to ensure that, if our paths ever crossed again, I would be ready. For now, all I had were memories of a life that had never been real and a determination to make sure no one else suffered the same fate.